Hi, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about reinforcement, feedback, and intrinsic motivation. Okay, so this is probably going to be a little shorter than the last video on goal setting, but I do want to touch upon some of the more important highlights from Chapter 6. And probably during this presentation, I'm going to draw a little bit on the board also. All right, let's go ahead and get cranky. All right, so what we're going to try and do in this session, we're going to understand a little bit more about what feedback and reinforcement is. We're going to talk about some principles of reinforcement, and then we're going to move on to talk about some issues relating to punishment, and then we're going to move on. I'm going to skip over a few things and go down to talking about flow. Now, flow is a very unique part of sports. We call it optimal experience. Some of you have probably heard it called in the zone performance. But flow is a very fundamental part of an experience that we want to recapture as much as we can when we work with competitive athletes. And so we'll go ahead and define it, talk about some characteristics of flow, and maybe give you some examples. All right, so let's go ahead and start on reinforcement. Okay, reinforcement, what is it? Well, reinforcement is the use of rewards and punishments that increase or decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring in the future, or a similar response happening in the future. So, I want you to think of three terms, okay? So, we have positive reinforcement, number one. Then we have negative reinforcement. That's number two. And then we have punishment. That's number three. Now, one of the keys is to understand that positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement are both positive. That word negative reinforcement, do not let it confuse you, and I'll explain in a second. Punishment is universally going to be recognized as something negative. So we have three terms here when we're talking about feedback and reinforcement to understand. So the first two, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, something positive is happening for the athlete. When we have punishment, it is 100% negative and perceived to be negative all of the time. So let's explain what these are. So I'll explain them first of all, and maybe we'll take a look at our PowerPoints and talk about them again. First of all, positive reinforcement is very easy. So say you want your athletes to come to practice on time. Okay, you've got a real problem with your athletes always being late, and so you want to positively reinforce those athletes that are showing up on time to practice. So what you decide to do is, randomly, you decide to have T-shirt days. So on a Monday, every athlete that's on time to practice, you give them a T-shirt. And then those athletes that show up late to practice don't get a T-shirt. Well, what are you trying to do with the T-shirt? You are positively reinforcing an appropriate behavior, a desirable behavior. Desirable behavior is show up on time to practice. Okay, so then maybe a week or two goes by and you do it again. And athletes that show up on time, you give them a T-shirt. Athletes that don't show up on time don't get a T-shirt. Well, very soon, hopefully, athletes are going to start showing up every day on time because they want the T-shirt, or they want a T-shirt, or maybe you do bagels or candy, but they want whatever that reward is, okay? So positive reinforcement is you're giving something to an athlete, or it could be kids in kindergarten, to reinforce a behavior, to make that behavior, or hopefully encourage that behavior to happen again and again and again and again and again. Okay, so that's positive reinforcement. You're giving something. Okay, something is perceived to be positive. Now, negative reinforcement, everybody gets confused on this. So let me explain this and hopefully stay with me. negative reinforcement is actually still a reward of sorts. That's why it's still something positive that's happening. But negative reinforcement involves a coach taking something away from the athletes that they might view as being negative. Let me give you an example. I don't know about you all, but when I used to play competitive soccer, one of the things I hated doing was drilling. I just didn't like drilling. I mean, sometimes the drills were fun, but I would much rather be playing or scrimmaging. So maybe, for instance, a coach will go and use the same example of being on time to practice. Maybe all of the players show up to practice on time. And so he basically says, or she says, because you all showed up on time today, I'm not going to drill today. We're going to do little 6-on-6 competitions. So what did the coach do? The coach took away something that the athletes viewed as negative and reinforced the behavior of being on time to practice every day. And did it by taking away something the athletes viewed as negative, so basically giving something positive to them. That's negative reinforcement. I know that a lot of you probably don't like to do preseason running. Well, negative reinforcement might be an appropriate way to eliminate running some days if you're trying to encourage a positive behavior happening. So don't get confused about the word negative here. Positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement both involve reinforcing a behavior. They're just done differently. The positive reinforcement, you're giving something to reinforce the behavior. The negative reinforcement, you're taking something away that the athletes view to be negative. All right, which takes us to punishment. Punishment is always deemed to be something negative by those that you are punishing. And we've got to be very careful about how we use punishment. Punishment can be used to reinforce a behavior not happening. So if there's an undesirable behavior occurring on your team or on your roster, then we can use punishment hopefully to prevent it from happening. You know, we do this all the time with little children, right? Like one of the punishments that, you know, my little kindergartner has to go through when he goes to school, when they're being naughty, they get sent to timeout, right? So the timeout means they've got to go sit in the corner, and they sit in the corner and can't interact, they can't do the fun activities they're doing in class. They're basically being punished. And so the idea behind punishment is that, you know, when you're breaking the rules, there's going to be a sanction, there's going to be a consequence, and, you know, you don't get to do the fun stuff. And that would be punishment. But there's no other way to view that than viewing it as negative. You know, sometimes when we're screwing up and we're not doing the things that our coach is asking us to do correctly in practice, what does our coach do? May make us run. Like if we had turnover after turnover after turnover in a basketball game, the next practice, you know, if we lost the game because of turnovers, you know, as a punishment, the coach is going to make us run. The coach is trying to reinforce that, you know, turnovers are bad, so we're going to punish you for making that mistake. But again, we have to be very careful in how we use punishment. We need to use it sparingly. So let's go ahead and talk about this in a little bit more detail. So some principles of reinforcement. If doing something results in a good consequence, such as being rewarded, people tend to repeat the behavior to achieve additional positive reinforcement. So that makes sense, right? So if everybody's getting that t-shirt, then they're going to keep showing up on time to practice, because the hope is that maybe more t-shirts are going to beat it down the line. And maybe after 3 weeks of doing this, maybe you don't give t-shirts out anymore. But the likelihood is that everybody's still going to keep showing up to practice on time because they don't know that they're not going to be receiving that t-shirt. If doing something results in an unpleasant consequence, such as being punished, people tend not to repeat the behavior. And they try and avoid it because they're trying to avoid the negative consequences. So this is basic principles of why we use reinforcement. Now, we do have to understand that using reinforcement can be very complex, because people do react differently to the same reinforcement. Some people might be very excited about a t-shirt. Other people, not excited about a t-shirt. So it doesn't really help if there's not something that the reinforcement is exciting in people. Likewise, kindergartners, there are some kindergartners that don't want to play. They don't want to interact in the activity. They'll deliberately do something to get into trouble so that they will be punished so they can go sit in the corner. So we've got to be very careful and understand that. People are unable to repeat desirable behaviors. Okay? We see that a lot actually in children. Some children, for one day, they do the right thing because they're getting a reward. but then they might not be able to repeat that desirable behavior all of the time. So they have another system at my school where Caden, my little boy, goes and they get a stamp. Every day they do something good or they obey all the rules, they get a stamp. And Caden tries so hard to be able to come home every day and get the stamp. And if he gets a whole week of stamps, then he can stay up later on Friday and watch a movie with his older sisters. So unfortunately, though, he falls into this. People are unable to repeat the desirable behaviors all the time because his motivation. I mean, he's a good kid and he wants to do all the right things, but he's still a kid. And things happen and things come up, and sometimes he gets baited into doing, acting out when the other kids are acting out. And so we've got to understand that it's a very complex thing when we try to understand these principles of reinforcement. And people receive different reinforcers in different situations. And people appreciate different reinforcers also. That t-shirt, again, might not be the reinforcer for everybody on your team. You may have to actually create something different for different people. All right, so approaches to influencing behavior. There's a positive approach and a negative approach. Positive focuses on rewarding an appropriate behavior, increases the likelihood of a desirable response in the future. A negative approach focuses on punishment, undesirable behaviors that hopefully leads to future redirection or canceling out of those undesirable behaviors. But notice, these are the positive approach. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, both positive approaches. Punishment is our negative approach. And again, don't get hung up on that word negative reinforcement. All right, so why are principles of reinforcement complex? Well, we already talked about that. Sorry, let's move on. I went the wrong way. Okay, here we go. Okay, the target approach to creating a positive motivational climate. So we can use the acronym TARGET. Tasks, authority, rewards, groupings, evaluation, timing. So this is all about creating a mastery-oriented climate by manipulating certain environmental conditions. So we can manipulate the task. That's easy to do. We can manipulate the authority or how we're leading the activity or who's responsible for leading it. We can obviously manipulate the rewards, t-shirts, bagels, candy, medals, trophies, positive reinforcement in terms of praise. Groupings, we can manipulate who works out with who. Evaluation, how we're evaluating the group, and obviously the timing of the reward system or the timing of the activities that we build in there. So we can manipulate all of these things in order to target the creation of a more positive motivational climate. Most coaches and instructors combine positive and negative approaches. It's a rare coach that doesn't use running as a punishment. Sports psychologists agree that the predominant approach with physical activity in sports participants should be positive because a negative approach often instills fear. Not even fear, it's usually resentment. Okay? We don't want our athletes to resent us as coaches or not come to practice because they are going to get punished all the time by doing things that are undesirable like running or doing lines or doing push-ups. So some principles of positive reinforcement. 1, choose effective reinforcers. There are different types of reinforcers. We have social reinforcers, which is praise, a good pat on the back. We have material reinforcers, which may be the t-shirt or some reward. Activity, special outings, could be taking the team out for dinner or going to a ball game. And then we have intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcers. But the most effective reinforcer is just praise. It's constant feedback. It's making sure that you say something positive about every athlete on the team at every practice. Number 2, choosing timing or schedule of reinforcement. We've got to be very careful with this. So early learning, continuous and immediate reinforcement is desirable. Learned skills, intimate and immediate reinforcement, desirable. So when we are first teaching a skill, we've got to be very intent on rewarding and reinforcing, because if we do that in the early stages, we're going to see the desirable behaviors that we want. The same is true when we're actually learning skills. All right, third principle or positive reinforcement principle. Reward appropriate behaviors. Choose the proper behaviors to reward. Now, this is an important principle. So when we are positively reinforcing, this is what we do have to be careful. Say we say, for instance, if we have 90% attendance at practice, early morning practice. If 90% of people show up for early morning practice, then we will play games in the afternoons practice. Well, we've got to be careful there because we are now giving everybody the same reward, but only 90% of people actually truly earned it. It would be like, for instance, me saying, if the average on the first test is 90% for the class, then everybody doesn't have to take the second test. Well, there's a problem there, because the 90% average might mean that a whole bunch of people made 100, but some people might have made a 50 or a 60. But they're getting the same reward and the same reinforcement as the people who got 90 or 100. So that becomes an issue. We've got to make sure we are reward appropriate behaviors and we don't give everybody the same reinforcement if they didn't earn it. Shape or reinforce successful approximations of difficult behaviors. So if the behavior gets close, we might need to still reinforce it. Because particularly if it's come a long way from the undesirable behaviors that were initiated to start with. Reward the performance as well as the outcome. Reward the effort and reward emotional and social skill. The big one here is rewarding effort. This is huge for children. You know, sometimes we get carried away to recognize only the kids that are doing really, really well. But what about the kid that's gone from here to there? We've got to make sure they get rewarded for their efforts and they're reinforced and that they're noticed, and we give them social praise because we obviously want them to still have good experiences. All right, providing performance feedback. The first thing is to provide knowledge of results. Okay, so feedback regarding the correctness of an action is crucial. So if I've got a kid that is just learning how to kick a soccer ball, and you see it all the time, when you're teaching soccer, kids come running up, they run up, and they stop, and then they kick a soccer ball. Well, if finally you're getting a kid to be able to run up, step down next to the soccer ball with the left foot, and then be able to kick all in one movement, then we should give feedback, and we should actually make sure that we give a self-efficacy statement, which means that we say, Johnny, great job, and tell them exactly what they did well. Great job, you stepped up and I saw you put that left foot down by the ball and I saw you kick all the way through and you did it all in one movement. That was beautiful. Congratulations, excellent. But we should also be sincere in our feedback. I mean, kids especially know when we're just BSing and we are not being true and honest and we're not showing integrity. So be consistent and be sincere. We should also provide motivational and instructional feedback. Motivational feedback is, good job, nice job. Instructional feedback is those self-efficacy statements. We're actually stating what they did well. One of my girls both my girls actually are playing in a YMCA basketball program right now. And they both have very different coaches. My 9-year-old has a coach that is out there going, good job, nice job, go, go, great stuff, yeah, you look awesome, nice. And it's good, but it's all motivational, sort of good, happy feel type feedback. I would argue that is not as useful as instructional feedback. The other coach that my 11-year-old has doesn't really give a lot of patting on the back and hoorah type stuff. It's more about, hey, way to use your legs when you shot that basketball. So that he's actually telling them what they're doing well. Or he might say, hey, good box out, way to turn on the ball and keep the girl away from the ball. But giving instruction, motivational maybe, but instructional absolutely. So both are important, but instructional feedback, particularly at the youth levels, is more important so the kid knows what they're doing well. Use various types of feedback: verbal praise, facial expression, pats on the back. All are important. Most of these are considered social reinforcers. But verbal praise, again, needs to be consistent, it needs to be sincere, and we've got to make sure that it's even too, particularly with youth. We don't want kids to feel missed out or slighted. I was a little upset a few weeks back because my 5-year-old boy is actually playing YMCA basketball, and he's got a weird name. His name's Caden. And he was the only athlete on his kids' roster, where the coach didn't know his name. So the coach would yell out, good job, and pat kids on the back, but I noticed the coach wouldn't say anything to Caden. And I realized pretty quickly the reason he wouldn't say anything to Caden is he didn't know his name, or he might have heard the name. I saw him once ask Caden his name, but I guess it was such a foreign name that he couldn't learn it. And so at the end of the game, I quietly went up to him and said, yeah, just so you know, my little boy's name is Caden. And then at the second practice, it was much better because the coach could actually use the name to express some feedback. So names are important. What not to do. Inappropriate approaches to motivation. Should not focus on criticism. Criticism just has a negative connotation. In fact, let's go ahead and put this up on the board. I apologize if I've already shared this with you in class. But criticism, we've got to be careful. Now, there is such thing as constructive criticism. And criticism is a form of feedback. But perhaps it's not the best form of feedback. I want you to think about the sandwich model. The sandwich model of positive feedback. All right, the sandwich model of positive feedback. Okay, this is what it looks like. Okay, and I want you to think of it just like a sandwich. So like a sandwich, we have a top bun, we have a top layer. That would be a positive statement. Okay? So if somebody did something really well, I'll give you a good example. I had an athlete when I was in Hong Kong right before I left. It was their first ever heptathlon competition, and she was really nervous about this competition, never done one before, and was a little nervous and didn't compete to the best of her ability, did enough to win the whole competition, but was really disappointed with her performance in several different events. So what I went ahead and did is when she finished the competition, first thing I said, you know what? Great job, your first ever heptathlon, and you won the event. That was tremendous. And you had, 2 great PBs in the 800 and the javelin. That was tremendous. Started with a positive statement. The meat of the sandwich is future-oriented instruction. Now, she did make some mistakes in the competition. She got very nervous, and so in the long jump, which is her best event, she scratched the first 2 jumps, and then she had to really back off and just get a jump in, so she got points in the long jump. She had similar problems in the high jump and got a little nervous, and didn't clear her height as she should have. So I could tell that she got very tense and forgot to breathe. And so a future-oriented instruction I gave her was, relax, breathe. Control yourself and your emotions before these competitions, and just believe in yourself. But the most important thing is visualize and relax. Treat competition just like you would practice. Okay, so I'm giving her a future-oriented instruction. And then we end with a positive statement. So what I did is I reinforced with her after I told her and gave her some strategies for what she could do to relax in between competitions in the heptathlon. And heptathlon, by the way, is 7 track and field competitions. It's 100-meter hurdles, the high jump, the shot put, 200 meters. The second day they come back with the long jump, the javelin, and then ends with the 800. So I ended with a positive statement, and I said, you know what, this is your first ever heptathlon, and you have now gone to the top of the 2011 rankings and 2012 rankings in Hong Kong. It's the #1 heptathlon. It's still your first competition. So that was great stuff. Now we can go back and work with some of the events that you felt probably didn't go so well for you this weekend, but you did a terrific job. So notice what I did. I didn't criticize her in any way. I gave her a positive statement to bolster her self-esteem. I gave her a future-oriented instruction. I gave her a lot of future-oriented instruction about things that she could do better in her next heptathlon. But I did it in a positive way. And I didn't criticize, and I didn't try and make her feel bad. But then I ended with a positive statement, restating something that she did well. This, by the way, will save marriages. I'm serious. Boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, employer relationships, classmate, roommate interactions. Positive statement, future-oriented instruction, positive statement is crucial. If you work as a teacher or you work as a coach, remember this. This is one thing that I want you to really take away from the class and remember. And I'll bring it up again in class when we come back from Hong Kong. All right, so what not to do. Focus on criticism. Do not use sarcasm, do not ever use physical abuse, and do not employ guilt. I see a lot of coaches, unfortunately, use this. They make athletes feel guilty if they perform at a substandard, but there usually is a reason that an athlete performed at a low standard. They shouldn't be made to feel guilty for it, particularly young kids. Punishment can control and change behavior, but 80 to 90% of all reinforcement should be positive. There's some drawbacks to using punishment. Punishment can arouse fear of failure. It can also act as a reinforcer. So some people, you punish them, and they might still do the undesirable behavior to be punished. It might be an attention-seeking behavior for them. Punishment can create an unpleasant and aversive learning environment, and we want to stay away from that. Some guidelines for using punishment: be consistent, give everyone the same type of punishment for breaking similar rules. Punish the behavior, not the person, and convey to the person that it is the behavior that needs to change, and allow athletes input in making up the punishments for breaking the rules. At the start of every season of my cross-country team, I would do this, particularly when I was at Lindenwood. I would actually have athletes on the first day come up with what they wanted to be the team rules. And it was fascinating. They came up with all the rules that I would come up with as a coach. But because they came up with it, it was much easier when they disobeyed the rules to say, all right, punishment fits the crime. You guys as a team came up with the consequence for this behavior. And you remember, and believe it or not, it created a lot less problems when the athletes had input into what those sanctions were going to be. Do not use physical activity as a punishment. Now, sometimes in sports we can't get away from it by running lines and running as a way of getting into shape, but by itself, do not use physical activity as a punishment. Make sure the punishment is not perceived as a reward or simply as attention, like I mentioned. And impose punishment impersonally. Do not berate the person or yell, simply inform the person of the punishment. So the worst thing we can do is destroy somebody's self-esteem and embarrass them in front of others by screaming and shouting, especially in front of a peer group. And finally, do not punish athletes for making errors while playing. So we've got to be very careful. I see a lot of times someone makes an error on the court and automatically they're pulled off the court. And they might not go back in for the rest of the game. You've got to be very careful, again, particularly at the youth levels. At the pro levels, it's a little different. Do not embarrass individuals in front of classmates or peers, and use punishment sparingly, but enforce it when you use it. If there is a consequence, and you've said there's going to be a consequence for a behavior, then make sure you're consistent in enforcing it. All right, so when we come back, we will talk a little bit more about modifying behavior. I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera right here to put the second half of this lecture together, which is talking about flow experiences.